All right, so we're going to go ahead and talk about chapter 23, which is transoceanic encounters and global connections. We're going to go ahead and talk about the first heading, which is the European reconnaissance of the world's oceans. So, coming off of the post-classical time period, Europe is a bit of a mess. As you can take a look, one of the reasons why Europe is not a big focus on the post-classical time period is just they're forming all sorts of different states. And while several of these states, especially the Holy Roman Empire, tries to centralize everything, it just never is to be. So as you can see, I like this map because it kind of shows you how, sure, this is the Holy Roman Empire. However, it's really kind of a patchwork. You can see Italy is nothing like we're used to. What's happening here in 1400 is we have Spain is starting to come together like we were thinking. But what's going to end up happening is, as you can see, you have a lot of these different empires. And a lot of these empires are actually relatively similar in the amount of power they have. So what that's going to do is this competition and this inability to create one centralized government makes European weak up into this time period, because instead of being able to fight each other, the Europeans are going to find it much easier to fight and trade with the rest of the world. And so this competition with each other is going to cause them to explore and take over many places around the world. Out of all the three things that are going to drive them is glory for their state, gold for their coffers, and God. Okay, so and out of all these empires that start things off, it's actually the mighty Portuguese who end up doing it. So as you can see, the Portugal are in an unenviable position where they're on the coast and they're next to what's going to be a powerhouse of Spain. So during the 1400s, Spain is going to consolidate with the marriage, and so what's going to happen is they can't go to the east. They're not going to be able to get that way, and so they only have the ocean to go to. So originally, they're going to look over for new fishing areas to go. But what they do is they realize that there are these islands off of Africa, and so these islands are amazing because of their ability to take it over, and also because the land is perfect to create that white powdery substance that we all know, love, and is addicted to, that gives us a ton of energy, which is, of course, sugar. That's right. So sugarcane is able to be grown in these areas. And just as we are now, Europe has a sweet tooth and wants as much of that as possible. So they start to take this over and then realize that they and everyone else, they wanted to create trade routes to Asia for all the things that are over there. The Silk Roads, the land roads, which we know have been around for over 1,000 years, become especially dangerous. Not only does the Mongolian Empire collapse, but the bubonic plague has happened, and people are scared of catching other horrible diseases. However, because of that, that means that less items were coming, and if there's less items, that means they're more expensive because they're more rare. So as those prices increase, so does the need to find their own trade routes where they're avoiding the Silk Roads, avoiding the Muslim merchants. And so especially the need for Indian pepper and Chinese ginger becomes essentially incredibly important to the diet of European wealthy classes. And if you don't understand why, you probably have had good refrigeration. So pepper, spices especially, are so important for that time. The other thing is, not only do we have those items in silk and porcelain, but also Africa has a thriving marketplace of gold, ivory, and slaves. So we've gone glory, we've talked about gold, and the other thing is missionary efforts or God. So Christianity puts an emphasis on converting people to their religion, and Europe is going to do this in a variety of ways, sometimes through peaceful methods, through the Franciscan and Dominican missionaries, sometimes through violent efforts, through like the Crusades and the Reconquista. Now, how is this possible? How are they suddenly able to do all of this travel? Well, there's going to be parts of technology which are kind of put together and really arguably perfected under the Europeans. So as this ship is just an example, we see the Chinese rudder, which allows you to kind of cut along ocean currents. You see the square sails, which are important to be able to, when you have the wind directly at your back. But the other thing is having triangular sails, either just these triangular Latin sails, or like in this case and in others, having both. Now these Latin sails are important because you can adjust them to catch the winds and the crosswinds to help you get wherever it is you need to go. The other thing that's happening is there's going to be this knowledge is going to coalesce about the different wind currents and ocean currents. Part of this again because of the Crusades and the trading and some of the increased communication. So what's going to happen is having the compass and the astrolabes are going to be very important to be able to do that, but also knowing how the winds and currents naturally want to go. So as you can see, along the northern hemisphere, the winds and ocean currents tend to be clockwise, and then below the equator, they tend to be counterclockwise. And so how is this important? Well, it's important, for instance, what the Portuguese are going to figure out through the return through the sea. So what they're going to do is as they explore, they're going to come down here to the south. And this is relatively easy because the ocean currents and wind wants to take you down there. Now you would normally think, okay, I'm going to go down there and then I'm going to come back that way. But the thing is that way you're fighting against the wind and currents. So actually, if you kind of go where the ocean wants you to go, you kind of follow this pattern. And so what Portuguese sailors figured out is you can go south, and then once you get down here and the current gets weaker, you can start to cut up. Once you cut up, you can hit the Portugal current, and that will take you quickly back to Portugal. Okay? So there's several breakthroughs that we need to know about. So the Portuguese are going to be for about 100 years the most powerful European country, arguably, and definitely one of the most important. And that's going to be because of their explorations. So Prince Henry of Portugal is going to finance a lot of trips down the Western African coast. And as they do that, they're going to start creating their own little fortified trading posts. So basically um, armed trading posts where they can get help and they can possibly start collecting taxes from other European nations. What's going to happen is that although they can go down the western coast of Africa, the real money makers, if they can find a way to get all the way into that Indian Ocean trade basin, and so they go south. And Diaz is the first one who's going to round the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern tip of Africa. However, the seas down there in the southern sea very difficult to navigate your way through. So, because of the storms and the restlessness of the crew, once he gets all the way down to the south and starts coming back up to the north, the crew is done. And so, just to keep his life, he returns back to Portugal. It's not until we get to Vasco da Gama, who's actually going to use the same route that Diaz used to get below the Cape of Good Hope and come back up in 1497. And so by then, by 1500, they're going to have a trading post in India called Calicut. So let's take a look and see. So that first one is in purple, voyages of that are sponsored by King Henry or Henry the Navigator. We can see Diaz is going to go down, get to the Good Hope, and have to come back up. And then Vasco da Gama is the first one to make it all the way around. And as you can see, it gets relatively close to Brazil. Portugal is going to discover Brazil in about 1500, and that's for another time. Anyway, we go all the way down, we get through the Cape of Good Hope, and then this should make sense to you because we've already learned about this Swahili city-states. And so he starts to visit some of those places and creates a trading post here in Calicut. And once they go do that, they can go ahead and go back. And this is incredibly important to the Portuguese because it puts them in a huge position of power. Any trade cities they can create here is going to be able to start to strengthen the natural resources they can use. Also, is the possibility of making trade much easier. And so you don't have to pay all the other merchants, all the Muslim merchants are here, or you don't have to pay for the people who come across the Silk Road to give you your goods. So not to be outdone, we have Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus was from what we would consider Italian, although Italy wasn't around at that point. And one thing that I really need to get rid of is this idea that educated people thought that the earth was flat. They did not believe then, as is now, intelligent people don't believe the earth is flat. So we had figured out by the time of the ancient Greeks that we actually were on a sphere. And so what happened is that when the Greeks actually, amazingly, were able to figure out about how large the earth was, but they still couldn't prove it. No one had made those journeys. Now, Christopher Columbus thought, you know what, through his calculations, Japan was only about 2,500 miles west of the Canary Islands. He was off. it's about 4 times further. But again, that's closer to what the ancient Greeks thought. But he couldn't. But he said, no, I can do it. And so he goes to Portugal at first, who was funding a bunch of trips. And the Portuguese kings decide, you know what? We're not gonna. We've already got this one trade route where the first one's there. We need to solidify that. And so he goes to basically the new kingdom of Spain with Ferdinand and Isabel. And at the time that the Reconquista was ending, he asked for and was able to get ships to go try his voyage. As we mentioned, he does not. His calculations are off by like a factor of 4, but he does discover something that's even more valuable, which is going to be the Americas. He doesn't find. He finds the Bahamas and Cuba, and again, we'll talk much more about this once we get to that specific chapter. So Columbus is going to try 4 times to get through, to sail here to the west. And as you can see, he goes at first, lands in the Dominican Republic, which we can talk about later, and around in Cuba and all this Bahamas. He tries once, so 1492, he sails the Ocean Blue. And by the time we go to 1504, Spain said no more. It's like, okay, you tried 4 times, you're not going to be able. He's not going to be able to make it work. Okay. But what's going to happen here is Columbus is going to discover the Americas, and quickly the British, French, Spaniards, and Dutch are really going to rush to try to get their own pieces of the Americas. Again, the Vikings were the first Europeans to discover, but they were all the way north where it was very difficult to live, and so Columbus was the first one to find these economically, environmentally, potentially vibrant areas of the Americas. Okay, so now even with all this, we still haven't circumnavigated the globe. So what's going to happen is that Vasco de Balboa is going to be the first one to officially, quote unquote, discover the Pacific Ocean. While searching for gold in Panama in 1513, he's going to move across and realize that there's a separate ocean. Now, again, this is going to be incredibly frustrating because it's really not that many miles of land between the Atlantic and the Pacific when it comes to Panama. But it's definitely way too much for you to be able to move a ship across. So it's not going to be to essentially the 20th century until we have the ability, 19th, 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century to be able to create the Panama Canal, much more of that in U.S. history and later on. Anyway, the person who does circumnavigate the globe is going to be Ferdinand Magellan, who actually doesn't get the help of the Portuguese, who again were trying to solidify their route to India, but uses Spanish support to circumnavigate the globe from 1519 to 1522. Okay, now what's going to end up happening is he's going to make it all the way down here. And like I mentioned, like here's the Cape of Good Hope down here. So he goes all the way down here. This sailing is incredibly difficult down here. So he goes through, he actually doesn't get to the southernmost tip. He does find a little canal here, which we call the Strait of Magellan, that he goes into. And then he crosses, and what's going to happen is especially here, this is the no man's land. He's going to have a lot of his crew actually die from scurvy. They don't have the nutrition available to them. And so when they get here to the Philippines, there's going to be an issue for Magellan. And so what's going to end up happening is that he's actually going to be killed here. But as we move through Indonesia and through the Indian Ocean Trade Basin, we hit the Cape of Good Hope and then back up. So officially technically Magellan and Elcano, but usually Magellan is the one who's given credit for circumnavigating the globe for the first time. Now, they aren't the only ones. Spain isn't the only one trying to explore the Pacific. And that's one of the really new, incredible things about this time period. This is the first time where humans are really going to be able to create maps of the entire globe. So the Spaniards are going to create a trade route between what we know as Mexico today and then across into the Philippines. But other than that, we're going to have a lot of different explorers kind of look. Francis Drake from England is going to explore the West Coast. Bering of Russia is going to sail through the Bering Strait. We're going to try to cut across the Northwest, but as you'd imagine, there's too much ice up here. It's not until the 20th century that we can do that. But out of all of them, the one who arguably is the most impressive is definitely James Cook of England, who's going to explore much of the Pacific. So he's got three main voyages he's going to go on. And as you can see, his route is even more intricate than that, but I figured this was enough without making your eyes bleed. So three different times he sails into the Pacific and is able to, going this way or going east. And what he's able to do is he explores even up here at the Bering Strait until we get into ice. He does a lot of the initial scholarship for the South Pacific. He's going to be the first one to really to find this wonderful underbelly of Australia that unfortunately the Asian empires weren't able to find. Much more on that later, but I just wanted to show you all the routes that he went on. And with that, that is the European reconnaissance of the world's oceans.